In this two-part video series, I'm going to make up and smoke some brisket pastrami, and I'm hopefully going to make it really easy for you to replicate at home and take away all the complications that often come with pastrami recipes. It's really easy to do. The only hard thing is waiting for it to cure. We're also going to be making up some homemade mustard, some homemade pickles, and some rye bread to make an incredible pastrami sandwich. So starting off with the pastrami itself, there are quite a few cuts you can use to make pastrami. Quite often it's going to be the brisket, and specifically the brisket flat. So this is a brisket flat that I picked up from my local butcher, and you can absolutely do this with a whole pack of cut brisket. I just want to make some sandwiches up with this. And in terms of trimming, all I'm going to do is shape this up. You can see there's some point muscle on here, so all I'm going to do is just tidy this up, take off this big bit of deckle fat here. This will go into making sausage or burgers, and we've got a really long whole flat muscle. What I am going to do is take off this really thin end, and what we're left with is a much smaller piece of brisket flat, a lot thinner than I'd like, a lot smaller than I'd like, but it should work out just fine. Next thing we need to do is weigh this up. This weighs 1,549 grams. So I'll write that down, very important. So now we've got our meat that we want to use trimmed up, ready to go. And we now know the weight of that meat. Next up, we need to weigh up our water. Again, very important that we know the weight of the water. So I'm gonna get my brining container. I'm using this today. This is a food safe plastic container. And I'm gonna estimate that about 3 liters or 3,000 grams is gonna be more than enough to submerge this entire piece of brisket flat. So I'm gonna weigh out 3,000 grams of water. 3,000 grams, and I'm going to pour that into a big stock pot. So we have our stock pot filled with 3,000 grams of water. We also have our brisket flat, and the weight of these two things combined is what I'm going to call my total weight. 3,000 grams of water and 1,549 grams of brisket. This is the total weight. Pretty simple. Put these to the side. So we've got those weighed out. We know what our total weight is, 4,549 grams. And if you don't already own a set of scales, I highly suggest you get some. You can't get more accurate than working in grams. We need to weigh out 2 more things, and we need to be pretty accurate with those. Those 2 things are cure number 1. That's the thing that's going to keep our pastrami nice and red. It's the thing that's going to cure it and prevent bacterial growth. And the other thing is salt. We're going to be basing how much of those 2 things we use off that total weight. So I actually use my more precise digital scales for measuring these things out. So starting off with our curing salt, we need to use 0.25% of the total weight to ensure that we get a perfect cure all the way through, and to keep things safe, which works out to be 11.37 grams. And if you're wondering why this curing salt isn't pink, in the UK they recently changed it from pink to white, as people were confusing it with pink Himalayan salt, which is why I think they changed it to pink in the first place, so people wouldn't confuse it with regular salt. So I have no idea. So it's no longer pink itself in color, but still does the same job. So that's our pink curing salt. Next up, we're going to need 2% of the total weight in regular salt. That works out to be pretty much bang on 91 grams. 91 grams of salt. And don't worry about keeping track of this. The recipe will be down below. But the other things we're going to use are some yellow mustard seeds, some juniper berries, some black peppercorns, some coriander seeds, some crushed red chilies, cinnamon stick, some cloves, some allspice berries, which I'm just going to toss in with the juniper berries, and some bay leaves. Just going to toss those in with the crushed chilies. And this next step is completely optional, but I'm going to take a pestle and mortar and take my coriander seeds, my mustard seeds, my juniper and allspice berries, my black peppercorns, and just going to give them a light roll just to open some of them up, just lightly crush them. Put all of this to the side, bringing back our brining pot, and we are going to go in with our salt, our pink curing salt, bay leaves and crushed chilies, cinnamon stick, and all of those things that we just crushed up, with the addition of the clove, which I didn't crush up. And now we're going to bring this up to a boil. Nice and simple. And I'm going to put a lid on this to help it boil quicker, and more importantly, to make sure that we don't lose too much of that liquid in steam. We're definitely going to lose a little bit of water, but if I can minimize the amount of water lost through steam, then I'm going to remain closer to my original 3,000 grams. So give it a couple of stirs, make sure everything's dissolved, then we'll move on. So the brine just came up to a boil. Just as it did, I turned it off. Next thing we're going to do is go in with some very lightly crushed, not peeled, garlic cloves, and now we need to let that cool. The next big step is pouring that brine over our raw brisket, but absolutely don't pour hot brine liquid over your raw meat. That's probably not going to lead to a good outcome. So this brine needs to cool down completely. The more common way to do this is to start off with half the amount of water that you need. Make your brine, boil it, and then add the other half in ice or ice water to rapidly cool down the brine. But I'm not in a rush today. It's just another step that I don't really need to be doing. So I'm gonna let this cool down completely. Once it is cool, I'll get it into my brining container and add my brisket flat. So a good couple of hours later, this is nice and cool. It's actually been in my fridge for the last 2 hours or so. I had to go out, thought I'd put it in there to keep it cool. And we have our brining container, and fresh out the fridge, we have our brisket flat. And I'm gonna be completely honest, I forgot to put the sugar into this and film it. I did it off camera, I'll just explain. I put in 1% of the total weight in brown sugar. It turned out to be about 45 grams in this case. Put it in whilst it was cooling down, stirred it round, it dissolved pretty quickly. So yeah, completely forgot. Anyway, we are gonna take our brine. That smells really, really good. Very fragrant, very fruity, not overly garlicky. I feel like garlic can way overpower this brine, so I put them in at the end when it's off the heat. And yeah, this is ready to have some brisket or any kind of meat dunked into it. So this is gonna go straight in, make sure it's fully submerged, which it is. I'm gonna pop the lid on this, and then this is gonna go into the fridge for 10 days. And every single day I'm gonna go in and flip it over. Make sure every side and corner of this thing has equal opportunity to absorb as much of that brine as possible. This is a pretty thin piece, so after 10 days, this is almost certainly gonna be perfectly brined all the way through. Pop the lid on, into the fridge, and come back in 10 days time. So we're about 2 days into this pastrami cure, which means we've got just over a week before it's ready. That gives us just over a week to make some pickles and make some mustard. So we're gonna make some dill pickles, so we'll give them a week to pickle. And making those up is really easy. Full recipe will be down below, but we're gonna go with some white vinegar, some water, some turmeric. This is gonna make the pickles have a nice bright green color. Some crushed chili flakes, some mustard seeds, some coriander seeds, and some salt. Gonna whisk that around and then get that onto the boil. Meanwhile, we're gonna take our pickling container, big handful of dill, push that down, bruise it. Some garlic cloves, these are skin on, just crushed them with my hand. Then normally when I'm making pickles, I'm just gonna use a regular salad cucumber, an English cucumber. But whilst I was shopping, I came across these pickling baby cucumbers. You could pickle them whole, but I'm gonna cut them down into spears. I'm also gonna do some regular cucumber pickles and some pickling cucumber pickles. And apparently, if you take off the end that doesn't have the stem, this is gonna increase your chance of retaining nice crispy pickles. Apparently this contains an enzyme which breaks the pickles down. Don't know if that's true or not, but it's coming off. Then I'm just gonna cut them down into halves. I'll have something pickled that looks like that, all ready to go. So these are gonna go in, gonna lay them down. Then I'm gonna do some regular ones as well. Make some spears out of these. I'm really just gonna try and fit in as many of these as I can. Then we're gonna add 2 bay leaves. You can use grape leaf, but these are gonna add tannins to this mix and help to ensure the pickles remain crunchy. Then just take the boiling hot brine, pour it directly over the cucumbers, try and make sure everything's submerged, and a little paper towel will help with this. And that's the pickles done. So once these are cooled down, these can go into the fridge, and technically these are ready to eat now. But I recommend at the very, very least, put them in the fridge overnight before you crack into them. But if you can wait 7 days like I'm going to, it's gonna be worth it. So these can go into the fridge for the next week. So the final component to our pastrami sandwich, other than the bread, is mustard. So we're gonna make up a deli style mustard from scratch. And this is gonna be super easy. Recipe will be in the description below, obviously. We're gonna go in with some mustard seeds. These are yellow mustard seeds. I wanted to do half yellow and half brown, but I couldn't find any locally, and Amazon didn't get here in time. So yellow mustard seeds it is. Then we're gonna go in with a sprinkling of turmeric, not a huge amount, some white vinegar, some water, some apple cider vinegar, some salt, and just a touch of sugar. Get that really well mixed around. Dissolve the sugar, dissolve the salt. Pop a lid onto this, put it somewhere dark, and just like the pickles, in 7 days, this will be ready to turn into a deli, slightly coarse mustard. And it's gonna be perfect on our pastrami sandwich. And that is pretty much it for this part of the smoked pastrami brisket 2-part series. So get out there, get yourself a brisket or some other type of meat, make the pastrami, and next week we'll get into smoking the pastrami, tasting the pastrami, making some bread, making up a sandwich, and it's definitely gonna be good. So it has been almost 10 days since I put a brisket flat into a brine to make pastrami. So in the last video, we made up some mustard, made up some pickles, made up some pastrami that isn't yet fully cured. So very quickly, before we get started, let's check in on those. There they are, looking nice and green, all that chili at the bottom there, all that dill. These have been going for 7 days. They smell good. They look like that. They look like a pickle. And in terms of the crunch, it's there. Homemade pickles, couldn't be easier. They got some heat to them. And the other thing we did was prepared some mustard. And if you remember, the liquid on here was probably up here. These should be nice and soft, ready to blend down into a spreadable mustard. So before we get into our bread and smoking the pastrami, let's make some mustard, which is going to be really simple to do. Pour it into a blender or NutriBullet. You could use a stick blender and just whiz that up until you come to a nice fine spreadable paste. And what you're left with is a real thick paste, a mustard paste. Really, really good mustard, not perfect for the application that we want to use it for, which is more like a sandwich spread. I want to turn this into more of a spreadable deli style mustard. And there are a number of ways that you can do that, but for me, I like to add a little bit of water just to thin it out and go in with some American mustard. Typical hot dog mustard, get that back on. Adjust the consistency of the water and the French's, and you should have yourself some nice spreadable deli style mustard. From there, just get it into a container. If you want it sweeter, add sugar, give it a stir, it will dissolve. If you want it more acidic, add more white vinegar. For me, I want it slightly more acidic, so I'm gonna add some white vinegar, not a lot. Give it a really good stir around. Nice and acidic, nice and spicy, perfect for our pastrami sandwich. The mustard is done. That can just go back into the fridge until tomorrow. Next thing we need to do is make up the rye bread. Now you can make this in day. I like to bulk ferment it overnight, so basically make it the day before I intend to bake it. That's gonna help with flavor development. Either way, it's the day before this brisket comes out of its brine, so I'm gonna make up some rye bread to bake tomorrow. And to do that, I need some bread flour and obviously some rye flour. Obviously, you could do this in the stand mixer. I'm not, purely because I don't want to have to wash it up. We'll add to that some salt and some dough conditioner. Going to disperse all of that salt and that dough conditioner amongst the flour. And then we can put this to the side. Then we're going to take a bowl onto some scales and weigh out 330 grams of warm water, some active dry yeast, some sugar or some honey. I'm gonna go with a little squeeze of honey. We're gonna set that aside for 15 minutes, bringing back in the flour and my nice foamy yeasty water, pour that all over. Then go in with some caraway seeds and just start to bring this together. Turn it into a shaggy dough. I'm just really trying to hydrate all the flour at this point. You can smell the caraway seeds already. Once that's all come together, looking nice and rough, just gonna set it to the side for about 30 minutes. Towel, plate. So while that dough is autolyzing, I'm gonna pull together my rub for my brisket tomorrow. I like to do things ahead of time where I can, just so I have things ready. And we're gonna go more with a Texas rub than we are a traditional pastrami rub. I want a dark, heavy, peppery bark on this rather than one that's really fragrant and floral with coriander seeds. You can do whatever you want with the rub, just remember not to use salt, as this thing is gonna be plenty salted. I'm gonna go simple with black pepper and coriander. So I'm just gonna take a empty rub bottle, coarse black pepper. Gonna go roughly 3:1 black pepper to some crushed coriander seeds, and just a light crush. I want it to be quite a coarse rub. That can hang out ready for the morning. This has just been hanging out, pretty much doing nothing for the last 30 minutes or so. And now we're gonna go in and start kneading this. It's a pretty stiff dough, so be aware of that. And we're just trying to form some gluten. So after a good 5 minutes of mixing in the bowl, you can see that it wants to come into a ball. It's definitely not gonna look like your average pizza dough ball, but it's gonna look a lot smoother than it did when we first pulled it out. Last step, gonna take a dough scraper, into a storage container overnight, and let this bulk cold ferment in the fridge. We'll see this in the morning. So that's pretty much it for bread, pickles and mustard. We'll come back tomorrow, pour the brisket flat out of the brine, rinse it off, season it up and smoke it. 10 days after this brisket flat went into this brine, and it is looking pretty disgusting, to be honest. It's a little bit slimy, that's absolutely fine. A lot of stuff coming out of this meat as well as going into it when a brine happens. Works both ways. We are gonna rinse this off pretty heavily. So we don't need to soak this, but we do need to rinse it. So I'm gonna take it over to the sink, rinse it in some really cold water and get all this stuff off it. So that is mostly rinsed off. Still some pepper and a little bit of juniper on there, some chili flakes, but that's absolutely fine. And I'm gonna hit this very, very heavy, just as if I was making a regular brisket. And the thing I love about this recipe is that you don't have to soak your brisket. It should just be perfectly salted straight out the gate. I think that looks really good. Hopefully we should get a nice crust on there. So all we need to do now is take this outside and put it on your pit of choice. I was gonna put this on the offset, but I think I'm just gonna go for the pellet smoker with a smoke tube. So I'll start about 165 Fahrenheit just to get good color, good smoke flavor with a smoke tube. Then I'll kick it up to around 250 and pretty much cook there until it's about time to wrap, which just like a normal brisket will be somewhere in the region of 165 to 180. Then I'll kick it up to around 250 and pretty much cook there until it's about time to wrap. Wrap it in some foil and then bump the temps up to around 275 until it's nice and tender. So let's take this out to the pellet grill. The pellet grill's not actually on, this is all smoke tube, and I'm using Pit Boss mesquite pellets. Really enjoying those pellets at the moment. Good flavor, good pellets in general. We'll get the brisket on and get the pellet grill fired up. Turn the Traeger on, set to 165 and smoke here for about 3 hours. Moving back onto our bread, this has been proving overnight in the fridge. You can see it's gassed up nicely. Whew, yeasty. Now we're gonna get it out and let it prove one last time. Reshape it into a ball. Then we're gonna take a Banneton basket, I think that's what it's called, and we're basically gonna put it in here and let it rise up one last time before we bake it. Heavily coat that in flour, a little bit on top of the dough ball itself. And then we are gonna go seam side up, put this cover on. And now I'm gonna let this hang out for about an hour, maybe an hour and a half. I've got my oven set to 190 degrees Celsius, and we'll come back to this in a bit. This bread has been resting for about an hour and 15 minutes, and it's increased in size a little bit. And quite often you see these being baked in bread pans or bread-shaped Dutch ovens, but I don't have one of those. But what I do have is one of these, just a cast iron Dutch oven. I've done some test bakes of this in this, and it works pretty well. You'll notice that this isn't pre-warming in the oven. If you pre-warm this, this is gonna get too hot, it's gonna scorch the bottom. So what I found is having this cool, putting the bread in, putting this into the oven gets you the best results. And to make sure things don't stick, I attempted to cut out a circle. Didn't come out round, but it definitely works. This is just some parchment paper, and this might get a little messy, but absolutely fine. Lid goes on, and this goes into my preheated oven for an hour. I'm looking for a light color on this rye bread, not a dark color. I want it to be somewhere between a traditional rye bread and sandwich bread. It's not gonna be too crusty on the outside. You could put it back in uncovered if you're not happy with how dark it is, but for me, that much time does it. So I'm gonna put this in the oven. An hour and 15 minutes or so later, this is done. And let's have a look. Looking very good. So that is very hot, and I like to use a little pastry brush, just a dry one, to get some of this extra flour off. I don't like the bread to be too floury, so I'm going to get the excess off. So we're going to let this cool down completely, and ideally overnight, and then we'll slice into it and use it for our pastrami sandwich. So this thing has been cooking for about a total of 7 hours. We did the first 2 hours or so at around 165 Fahrenheit, then bumped it up to 250, and it's been there for about 5 hours. It's now hit 170 internal, so we're going to wrap it up and finish off the cook. It's looking nice and dark. Now we just want to get it tender. So this is going to go back onto the pit for another couple of hours at probably 275 Fahrenheit until it gets nice and tender. It will feel slightly firmer than what you're looking for in a traditional brisket. So we're going to put this back onto the pellet grill. This pastrami is done. It's nice and tender, probing about 194. So let this rest a little bit and get our pastrami sandwich ingredients together. Starting off by slicing our bread. That's looking good. Nice sandwich thickness slices. That caraway smells so good. Let's get some of that mustard on there. Check out how this pastrami is looking. Nice and barky. And I think I'm gonna hit it with a little bit of this liquid from the wrap. And I want this nice and thin. That is some beautiful, barky, well cured all the way through pastrami. I might actually start to cut this on a bias just a little bit, just to lengthen out those slices. We can get slightly taller slices if we cut at a bit of an angle. The lighting in here is not very good, but I'm hoping you can see that color. I've got a big bright white light right next to me, which doesn't help. Slice it's nice and thin, juicy. I love the bark on that. Or from the pellet smoker as well. Who'd have thought? Bring back that bread. I'm gonna pile this pastrami very high. Then I'm gonna hit that with some melty Swiss cheese. I just microwaved this, to be honest. Felt like the easiest way to do it. Top that with another piece of rye. And that is looking like a nice pastrami sandwich. Cut it down the middle. few little pickles in there, perfectly cured pastrami, some homemade rye, that homemade mustard, some pickles just to top it off, melty Swiss cheese. Yeah, I could not be happier with that. I'm just gonna have to bite into it. Oh wow. Yeah, I mean, that was a lot of effort, took a long time. That is up there. That homemade mustard is coming through, it's pretty spicy. The melted Emmental, essential, and it has to be rye bread. Love the bark on that pastrami as well. Lots of pepper, very pepper heavy. You don't need to go as heavy as I did. And it's not too fragrant with the coriander seeds, which I like. There we go, some sliced pickles in there. A delicious bite. Yeah, all that pepper plus the spicy pickles and the mustard really get to you. So I really hope you enjoyed that 2-part series and seeing the process to get this incredible sandwich and make some pastrami. If you did like it, please like, comment, subscribe, do all those things. It really, really does help me out. And yeah, please let me know if you give this a try. And yeah, if you've got a piece of meat on cure at the moment from watching the first part, please let me know in the comments to this one. I'd love to know if you followed that recipe. So thanks very much for watching. I'll see you next week for another video.